My name is Wilhelmina. I'm 31, and I've spent 9 years catching other people's babies for a living. So when my own son was born without a single member of my family in the building, I understood, in the very specific way only a labor and delivery nurse can, exactly how alone I actually was. Mom and Dad send their love, my sister Carlotta texted, at 6:42 in the morning. 40 minutes after I'd already pushed for 3 hours with my husband Desmond as my only witness, the message arriving while I was still being stitched, my phone face up on the rolling tray beside a cup of ice chips nobody remembered to bring me water to go with. I want to tell you I was surprised. I wasn't, not entirely. Some part of me had known for 6 weeks, since the date conflict first surfaced, that this was exactly how the day would go. What I did was hand the phone to Desmond without reading past the first line, and ask him to put it somewhere I couldn't see it, because there would be time, later, to feel whatever I needed to feel about that message. There wasn't time for it yet. There was a baby being weighed 4 feet away from me, and I wanted my whole attention on him. But to understand why my family chose, deliberately, with 6 weeks of advance notice, to be 3 states away at my sister's vow renewal instead of in that delivery room, I have to go back. Not far. Just 8 months, to the dinner where I announced I was pregnant and watched my mother's face do the math on which event mattered more before I'd even finished the sentence. I grew up in a family of 5 in Lansing, Michigan, the middle child between Carlotta, 2 years older, and my younger brother Desmond, no relation to my husband, who shares a name with my brother purely by an accident neither of them has ever found as amusing as everyone else does at holidays. My father worked maintenance for the school district for 31 years. My mother ran the household with the precision of someone managing a small business that happened to have feelings, and from the time I was old enough to notice anything, I understood that Carlotta occupied a category in that household that the rest of us simply didn't. It wasn't cruelty, not in any way you could point to directly. Carlotta was beautiful in the specific way that made strangers comment on it in grocery store lines, charismatic in the way that made her the center of every room without ever seeming to try, and from an early age she'd absorbed a kind of attention from my parents that read, to an outside observer, as simply natural, the gravitational pull of an especially bright planet. Mine and Desmond's roles, by comparison, formed early and held steady for 3 decades. I was the responsible one, the one who didn't need managing, the one whose accomplishments got acknowledged briefly and efficiently before the conversation circled back, as it always did, to whatever Carlotta needed help thinking through that week. I have one object that tells the whole history better than I ever could in words, a hospital bracelet, actually, the one I'm wearing right now as I tell you this, the one they put on Desmond Jr. the morning he was born. The one I haven't taken off in the weeks since because some part of me decided, somewhere in that delivery room, that I wasn't going to let this particular piece of plastic become one more thing nobody in my family noticed. I didn't see anything coming, not in the way people usually mean when they say that about a family pattern, because the pattern with Carlotta had never actually hidden itself. It had simply always been there, named in 100 small ways I'd absorbed so thoroughly I'd stopped registering them as remarkable. I became a labor and delivery nurse, in part, because I'd spent my entire childhood watching one woman get all the attention in a room and decided, somewhere along the way, that I wanted to be the person who made sure nobody, ever, went through the most vulnerable moment of their life without someone fully present for it. I just hadn't yet understood I'd be the one who needed that presence and wouldn't get it. I became a nurse because I liked rooms where the stakes were too high for anyone to perform for an audience, where what mattered was competence, attention, the specific quality of being fully present for someone else's hardest day. I built a career out of that instinct over 9 years, working my way up to a senior position at the same hospital where, eventually, I'd deliver my own son, a detail I found almost too neat when I realized it, like the universe had decided to make a point. I married Desmond 6 years ago, a structural engineer with a calm, steady presence that felt, after a childhood of orbiting my sister's gravity, like the first room I'd ever stood in where the attention wasn't divided unevenly before anyone had even walked through the door. My parents liked him well enough, in the distracted way they liked most things that weren't directly about Carlotta. My mother, at our wedding, gave a toast that mentioned Carlotta's upcoming engagement, not yet announced publicly, a detail Carlotta had apparently shared with our mother the week before my wedding, in the middle of what was supposed to be a speech about me. I want to give you the early signal, the one I filed away and didn't look at again for nearly 3 years. It was at my baby shower for my first pregnancy, the one that ended in a miscarriage at 14 weeks, a loss I won't dwell on here except to say that it happened, and that it mattered, and that my mother's response to it, at the time, was to mention, gently, that perhaps it was for the best timing-wise since Carlotta's wedding was the following spring and we don't want everything happening at once. I remember sitting in my own living room, 3 days after a DNC, listening to my mother explain the scheduling convenience of my own loss, and feeling something close, finally, but not all the way closed. I didn't say anything. I let the comment pass, the way I'd let comments pass for 30 years, because confronting it felt disproportionate to a single sentence, even a sentence that bad, even from my own mother in the middle of my own grief. That was the early signal, and what I did with it was nothing, which felt, at the time, like grace, the natural extension of being the family member who didn't make things harder, and which I wouldn't call grace anymore. The hook that tips toward trouble came 18 months later, when Carlotta announced, at a family dinner, that she and her husband Phineas were planning a vow renewal for their 5th anniversary, a full destination event in Sedona, with a guest list, a dress code, and a date that, when she announced it, sat exactly 6 weeks before my own due date, a detail nobody at that table seemed to register as relevant except me, doing the math silently while passing the green beans. The thing I didn't see, or didn't let myself see, or, more accurately, saw clearly and simply hoped wouldn't matter, took shape slowly over the following months, the way water finds the lowest point in a foundation long before anyone notices the crack it eventually opens. It started with small confirmations that the math I'd done at that dinner table was, in fact, the math everyone else had quietly accepted as settled. My mother mentioned, on a phone call about something unrelated, that she'd already booked her flight to Sedona for the vow renewal weekend, said casually, as though there were no possible conflict to flag. No reason to even mention it as a scheduling consideration relative to my pregnancy. I said, carefully, that's the week I'm due, or close to it. My mother said, oh, I know, but you never know with these things, you could go early or late, in a tone that suggested the uncertainty of childbirth timing was, somehow, a point in favor of her travel plans rather than a reason for concern. I let that pass too. I told myself she had a point, technically, due dates are estimates, not appointments, and I genuinely might go 2 weeks late, in which case there'd be no conflict at all. I held on to that possibility longer than the actual statistics justified, because the alternative required me to start a fight I didn't yet have the energy to start. My father's plans solidified next, predictably mirroring my mother's, and then my brother Desmond's. My brother, not my husband, a detail I want to keep clear because the two men sharing a name became, over those months, a small dark joke between my husband and me, the only humor we found in an increasingly humorless situation. All 3 of them booked flights to Sedona for the same weekend, the weekend that, as my due date approached and then arrived, became unmistakably, undeniably, the actual week I went into labor. I called my mother 5 weeks before my due date, sitting at my own kitchen table with my hand resting on a belly that had started to feel, by then, almost unbearably ready to be done being pregnant. I want to talk about the timing, I said. I know the trip's been planned for a while, but I'm worried you're going to miss the birth. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that, looking back, told me everything before she said a word. Carlotta's been planning this for over a year, Mina, she said, using the childhood nickname she only used when she wanted something to land softer than it actually would. The vendors are booked. The deposits are non-refundable. I don't think we can move it at this point. I'm not asking you to move it, I said, though some part of me, hearing myself say it, understood that I actually was, in the only way that mattered. I'm asking if you'd consider coming to Sedona a few days later, or leaving a few days early, so there's some chance you'd actually be here. We'll see how it lines up, she said, which is, I've come to understand, the sentence people reach for exactly when they have no intention of changing anything at all. These things have a way of working out. I asked her, directly, whether she'd considered simply not going, whether, faced with an actual scheduling conflict between her daughter's first living child being born and her other daughter's anniversary party, the math might come out differently than it apparently already had. The silence that followed that question was longer than the one before it. "Carlotta would be devastated if we weren't there," she said, finally. "You understand. It's her 5th anniversary. It's a big milestone for her." I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that the birth of my first living child was, by any reasonable measure, also a fairly significant milestone, one that, unlike a vow renewal, could not be rescheduled to a more convenient weekend if the original date proved inconvenient. I said, instead, "Okay," in the flat voice I'd later recognize, looking back, as the sound of me giving up on a fight I'd already, on some level, known I'd lose before I started it. I want to tell you I pushed harder after that call. I didn't, not really. I hung up, sat at my own kitchen table for a long while with my hand still resting on my belly, and told myself a version of the story that made the outcome bearable, that it probably wouldn't matter anyway, that I'd likely go past my due date the way everyone in my family seemed to be quietly betting I would, that this whole conflict was, statistically, more likely to resolve itself than not. I called that optimism. I wouldn't call it that anymore. That was the moment, though I didn't know it at the time. Not the scheduling conflict itself, the conflict I could have survived on its own, filed away as one bad logistical accident among many ordinary family inconveniences. It was the specific shape of the reason. Carlotta would be devastated. As though my own labor, my own son's birth, existed in a category of events that could simply be absorbed by whoever happened to be present, while Carlotta's anniversary required the entire family's physical attendance to be valid at all. I filed that sentence the way I file everything that matters, precisely, dated, in a place I could find it again. I didn't open the file fully for several more weeks. But something in me had already started keeping it. What I found, though found isn't quite the right word for something I'd actually known for weeks and simply hadn't let myself fully process, began in earnest the week before my due date, when my contractions started on a Thursday evening, 4 days before the Sedona event, in a window that should have given my family ample time to adjust if adjusting had ever genuinely been on the table. I called my mother first, from the hospital parking lot, contractions 5 minutes apart, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "It's happening," I said. "I'm at the hospital. They're admitting me." "Oh, honey," she said, and for one brief, hopeful moment I thought I heard something shift in her voice, some recalculation happening in real time. "We're literally about to board. Our flight leaves in 40 minutes. You're at the airport," I said, not quite a question, more a confirmation of something I'd somehow still been hoping wouldn't be true until I heard her say it directly. "We talked about this," she said, a note of mild irritation creeping into her voice, as though I were the one being unreasonable by calling it an inconvenient moment. "Carlotta's counting on us. You understand." I did not, in fact, understand, not in the way she meant it, but I also understood, standing in that parking lot with my hand braced against my own car door through a contraction, that there was nothing left to say that would change the calculation on the other end of that phone call. I told her I had to go, that another contraction was starting, and I hung up before she could say whatever she was going to say next, because I didn't have the bandwidth, in that moment, to absorb one more sentence designed to make her absence feel like the reasonable choice. I read the situation the way I read every patient chart in my professional life, flat, precise, without the editorializing I might have allowed myself in a different kind of crisis. My family had made a choice. The choice had been available to them for 6 weeks, clearly flagged, openly discussed, and they had made it anyway, repeatedly, at every opportunity I'd given them to reconsider. There was no remaining ambiguity to resolve. There was only a labor to get through, with or without them, and a son who was going to be born regardless of who showed up to witness it. I did one specific thing before I let myself feel anything else about it. I texted my husband, already on his way to meet me, a single line, "They're not coming. Boarding now." Then I put the phone in my bag, walked into the hospital where I'd worked for 9 years, where half the labor and delivery staff knew me by name, and let the part of me that needed to simply be a patient, rather than a nurse cataloging her own abandonment, finally take over. I gave them one more chance, in a sense, though by that point it was less a chance than a formality, a text I sent from triage, before things moved too fast for texting, that read simply, "Last call if anyone wants to change their flight." I mean it. I sent it to the family group chat, the one Carlotta had created years earlier for coordinating holidays, and watched the message sit there, delivered, read, unanswered, for the better part of an hour while my labor progressed around it. My husband sat beside me through every hour of it, and I want to be honest that his presence was enough, in the sense that matters most. I was not alone in any way that endangered my safety or my son's. But I want to be equally honest that there is a specific, particular loneliness in being surrounded by competent medical care, a loving husband, and still feeling the absence of the people who are supposed to be the first call, the first arrival, the family that shows up regardless of the inconvenience, because that is, I had always believed, the entire point of being a family in the first place. Around hour 6, my nurse colleague Priscilla, who'd worked the floor with me for years and had delivered 2 of her own children in that same unit, caught my eye during a brief lull and said, quietly, "Where's everyone?" Not unkindly. Just an observation, the way you'd note a vital sign that looked off. I told her, in 3 sentences, where everyone was. She didn't say anything else about it, just squeezed my hand once, briefly, and went back to checking the monitor, but I understood, in that small gesture, that she'd registered the absence as the strange and notable thing it actually was, rather than the ordinary inconvenience my mother had framed it as. I had been hoping, somewhere underneath the contractions, that someone would still show up, that my mother would call back from a layover, that my brother would catch a later flight, that some version of this story would end with at least one of them walking through that door before it was over. Nobody did. The hope didn't leave the room dramatically. It simply wasn't there anymore by the time I reached the point in labor where I stopped being able to track anything except the next contraction. I told myself, in the hours that followed, that I needed to get through the birth itself before I let myself think any further than that. I focused everything I had on the actual work in front of me, on Desmond's hand, on the specific rhythm of breathing my own training had taught me to coach other women through 100 times before I ever needed it myself, on the particular ordinary miracle of a person arriving into the world regardless of who else was or wasn't in the building to witness it. What I did, in the immediate aftermath, I did quietly, in the way that new mothers do most things in the first exhausted, overwhelmed days after a birth, not as a deliberate campaign, but as a series of small, instinctive choices that, looking back, added up to something more significant than any single one of them seemed at the time. I didn't call my family back right away. I let Carlotta's text, "Mom and Dad send their love," sit unanswered on my phone for the better part of a day, not out of strategy exactly, but because I genuinely had nothing in me yet to say that wouldn't have come out as something neither of us could take back. I focused, instead, on my son, on the specific weight of him against my chest, on the small, astonishing fact of his existence, which felt, in those first hours, considerably more important than anything happening 3 states away in Sedona. My mother called the following afternoon, her voice bright in a way that struck me as almost aggressively cheerful given the circumstances. "How is he?" she asked, as though the preceding day's events required no acknowledgement at all, as though her absence from the delivery room were simply a fact that had already been filed and closed. "He's perfect," I said, which was true, and which was also, in that moment, all I was willing to offer without being asked a direct question about anything else. "Send pictures," she said. "Everyone's dying to see him." I didn't send pictures that day. I told her I was tired, which was also true, and that I'd send some when I had the energy, and I hung up the phone and sat with my son asleep on my chest for a long while, looking at the wall, not crying exactly, just sitting with something that didn't yet have a shape I could name. I drafted, mentally, over the following days, exactly what I wanted to say to my family about what had happened, the way I'd draft a difficult conversation with a patient's family about a complication, carefully, without unnecessary heat, but without softening the actual facts either. I decided I wasn't going to perform forgiveness I didn't feel, but I also wasn't going to manufacture a confrontation I didn't actually want to have over the phone, in the middle of the most exhausting and tender week of my life. I helped Desmond handle the small logistics of the first 2 weeks, the meals people dropped off, the thank you notes, the quiet, exhausting choreography of new parenthood, and I noticed, doing it, exactly who showed up in person during that window and who didn't. My husband's parents drove 4 hours the day after we got home and stayed exactly as long as was helpful and not a minute longer, holding the baby, doing dishes, leaving casseroles in the freezer with labeled instructions. My own parents, my sister, my brother, remained in Sedona through the original event date, then home, then, eventually, simply absent in the specific way people are absent when they've decided a thing doesn't require their physical presence to be appropriately acknowledged. I told my mother, finally, in a phone call about 10 days after the birth, in a voice that did not shake even though my hands, holding the phone, very nearly did, exactly what I'd been holding back since the hospital parking lot. You missed his birth, I said. Not because something unavoidable happened. Because you chose Carlotta's anniversary party over being there, with 6 weeks of notice, and I need you to actually sit with that rather than just moving past it. She was quiet for a long moment. We talked about this, she said again, the same sentence from the hospital parking lot, as though repetition might eventually make the explanation more persuasive than it had been the first time. It wasn't a choice against you. It was just timing. It was a choice, I said. You had options. You chose the ones that put you in Sedona instead of here. She didn't have an answer for that, not really, beyond a slightly wounded silence that suggested she felt accused rather than simply described, which told me something too, about how unprepared she was to hear this framed plainly rather than softened. That night, after that call, I slept 4 hours in a row for the first time since the birth. My son finally settled in a stretch that felt, after everything, almost like a small mercy. In the morning, I made eggs, one-handed, my son in a carrier against my chest, a small, ordinary, undramatic thing to do in my own kitchen while, 3 states and 10 days away, my family continued posting vacation photos from a trip that had, after all, gone exactly as planned. The reaction, when it came in full, arrived 2 weeks after the birth, not as an apology, but as a message in the family group chat, the same group chat where my unanswered last call text had sat ignored through 6 hours of labor, asking, casually, whether I could send some good photos of the baby for everyone to see, maybe some professional-looking ones if you have them, a request that landed with a specificity of tone deafness I genuinely hadn't anticipated, even after everything. I read that message 3 times before I responded to anyone. Then I wrote back, to the group, a single line, I'll send photos when I'm ready. Right now I need you all to understand what missing this actually meant, not just ask for the highlights reel. Nobody responded to that message for 2 full days. When my mother finally did call, it wasn't quite an apology, but it was, for the first time, an acknowledgement that came close to one. I think we got the timing wrong, she said, which I noted, internally, as still managing to frame the entire situation as a scheduling error rather than a choice, but which was, nonetheless, more than she'd offered before. What came after arrived slowly, the way most real endings do, not in one dramatic scene, but in a string of smaller, quieter recalibrations spread out over the following year. My parents and Carlotta did eventually meet Desmond Jr., about 6 weeks after he was born, on a visit they scheduled with what felt, to me, like a deliberate excess of advance planning, as though to overcorrect for the previous failure of timing. The visit was pleasant enough, on its surface. My mother held him, cried a little, said he looked like me as a baby. I noticed, watching her, that some part of me had already adjusted my expectations downward in a way I hadn't fully registered until I saw how easily I accepted the visit as adequate, when a year earlier I might have expected, and wanted, considerably more. Carlotta sent a gift, eventually, a beautiful, expensive baby outfit that I appreciated and also understood, clearly, as a kind of substitute for the presents she hadn't offered when it actually mattered. I thanked her for it sincerely. I did not pretend the gift closed the gap the absence had opened. I started keeping a different kind of boundary after that, one I'd never quite had the vocabulary for before becoming a mother myself. I stopped automatically rearranging my own plans around Carlotta's milestones the way I'd done, unconsciously, for 30 years. When her next event came up, a smaller anniversary dinner, nothing on the scale of Sedona, I attended, because I wanted to, not because the family calculus demanded it, and I noticed the difference in how that felt, choosing presents rather than defaulting into it. My relationship with my mother settled into something quieter than before, not estranged, but recalibrated, the way a scale resets once you've finally weighed something accurately instead of trusting an old, slightly off measurement out of habit. We talk most weeks. She has never said, in the exact words I once imagined wanting, "I should have been there," and I've made a kind of peace with the possibility that she may never say it that plainly. What she has done, instead, is show up, in person, for the small things since Desmond Jr.'s first birthday, an ordinary Tuesday visit with no occasion attached at all, in a way she rarely had before, which feels, from her, like its own quieter form of acknowledgement. I kept wearing the hospital bracelet for nearly 2 months after the birth, long after any practical reason to keep it on had passed, until it finally wore through on its own and I had to cut it off in the bathroom one evening, my son asleep in the next room. I didn't throw it away. I put it in the small box where I keep the few physical objects from that week that actually matter: his first hospital cap, the tiny footprint card the nurses made, the bracelet itself, frayed and slightly yellowed now. I think about that bracelet more than I expected to, this far out from everything. It wasn't a symbol I chose deliberately, not at first. I just forgot to take it off, the way you forget to take off anything during the first exhausting weeks of a newborn's life. But somewhere in those 2 months, it became something else, proof worn on my own wrist that I had been there, fully, completely, for the most important morning of my life, regardless of who else had decided not to be. A family that only shows up for the events it finds convenient isn't actually showing up at all, it's just attending the parts of your life that don't cost it anything. I spent 30 years assuming presence was something my family simply provided as a matter of course, the unconditional backdrop against which everything else happened, and it took becoming a mother myself, alone in a delivery room with everyone who mattered most physically absent, to understand that presence has to be chosen, every time, specifically, by the people who claim to love you. I know that now. Not because anyone taught me. Because I finally stopped assuming love and convenience were the same thing, and started asking, instead, what people actually choose when those two things come into direct conflict with each other. There's a particular kind of family neglect that survives specifically because it never has to announce itself as neglect. Wilhelmina's parents never once said, explicitly, that Carlotta's anniversary mattered more than their grandson's birth. They simply made a series of individually defensible logistical decisions, non-refundable deposits, advance commitments, the practical difficulty of changing travel plans on short notice, that, taken together, amounted to exactly that conclusion without anyone ever having to state it plainly enough to be challenged directly. That's the precise mechanism that let this choice go essentially unexamined by the people making it. Every individual justification sounded reasonable in isolation, and nobody in that family had ever developed the habit of adding the justifications together to see what total they actually produced. What makes this story land harder than a simple scheduling conflict is the specific tone-deafness of the photo request 2 weeks later. Asking for professional-looking photos of a baby whose birth you deliberately missed isn't a small thoughtless lapse, it reveals an assumption that the experience itself can be substituted for entirely by its documentation. That missing the actual morning costs nothing as long as you eventually get to see good pictures of the outcome. That request, more than the absence itself, exposed how completely Wilhelmina's family had decided that her experience of becoming a mother was something to be summarized for their convenience rather than witnessed for its own sake. Carlotta isn't fully a villain in this story, even though the timing of her event created the entire conflict. She's a woman who has spent her whole life being the center of a family's gravitational field without ever having had to ask whether that positioning was fair to anyone orbiting around her. That's not necessarily malice on her part. It's the natural result of 30 years of a family dynamic that trained everyone involved, including Carlotta herself, to treat her milestones as the load-bearing events around which everyone else's calendar bent. The tragedy isn't that Carlotta wanted her anniversary celebrated. It's that nobody in that family had ever once tested whether her milestones could survive being deprioritized, because the question had simply never come up before. The hardest truth in Wilhelmina's story is the one she names herself, near the end, that she had spent 30 years assuming love and convenience were the same thing. They aren't, and the distinction is almost impossible to see clearly until a moment arrives that forces a family to choose between them in a way that can't be softened or rescheduled. Plenty of families never face that exact test, which is exactly why plenty of people go their whole lives without learning, the hard way, which one their family actually prioritizes when the two come into direct conflict. What changed everything wasn't the missed flight, or the unanswered group chat message, or even the unattended hours of labor itself. It was the specific request for photos 2 weeks later, because that request revealed, more clearly than the absence ever could on its own, that her family had never fully registered the absence as a loss at all, only as a logistical inconvenience that the right documentation could quietly resolve after the fact. If this story landed for you, it's probably because you've experienced some version of being asked to supply the highlights reel of a moment your family chose not to actually witness. The question worth sitting with isn't whether your family loves you, in the broad, general sense most families manage to convey. It's whether that love has ever been tested against something genuinely inconvenient for them to prioritize, and what you learned, in that test, about which one of you they were actually willing to rearrange their life for.